Hello, and welcome to this event with Demos and our Workshift Commission, which is a new programme of work we've launched with Julia Hobsbawm, who you'll be hearing from in a moment. I'm Polly Mackenzie. I am the Chief Executive of Demos, and in this event, we're joined by a really interesting panel to help us think through what a new model of work will look like after coronavirus. So this year, Demos has been working extensively with members of the public, as we normally do, to try and understand how life will change as a result of the coronavirus pandemic through a program called Renew Normal. And one of the clearest indications is that for a substantial proportion of the population, though not everybody, this experience this year has shifted their perspectives about how and crucially where they want to work. And going into next year with Workshift, working with Julia, we want to explore the implications of that for the workplace, for productivity, for diversity, and use this potentially as a catalyst to unpack and resolve many of the problems that have confronted us in the workplace for so many years. Something that Demos has worked on throughout most of our history. I've been back in our archives, and we first wrote a paper about telecommuting, as it was then called, back in 1994. So I'm thrilled to be joined by such a fantastic panel. First of all, I'm going to introduce Julia, who is chair of our Workshift Commission, but also a much celebrated author. Her book on the simplicity principle has won so many awards that I can't list them because I can't remember what they're all called. We'll then have James Sussman, who is an anthropologist and author of a book called Work, A History of How We Spend Our Time, to give us the really long view. Alan Lockie, a former colleague at Demos, but now head of the RSA's Future Work Centre. And then finally, Dennis Owusu-Sem, founder of Success Talks and a relationship manager at BMO Global Asset Management, to get their perspectives on how work can change through this pandemic. And then we'll open that up to a discussion and questions. There's a Q&A for you to use, so do pose your questions. Get started right now if you want, or anything that comes up, and we will involve lots of those audience questions in the discussion just as soon as our panelists have given their first opening remarks. So first, over to Julia.
Thank you, Polly. Hello, everybody. We're also used to this disembodied way of being and connecting, but if I tell you I'm not wearing pajama bottoms, I'm wearing my gym bottoms, but I'm trying to give a good impression of being in a corporate environment. Obviously, we're undergoing a huge shift. I'm delighted to be working with Demos to hopefully get over the next year or so some clarity around the opportunities that exist for transforming the world of work, because we are literally at a Malcolm Gladwell tipping point. The catalyst was the crisis, but the undercurrents have existed in the workplace long before. We all know that we were living with the effects pre-COVID of the fourth industrial revolution. We know that automation stalks the human in the machine age. We know about 0 hours. We know about all the threats to productivity. We know about the epic stress levels. 65% of all working days in the EU have been lost to stress. We know about stagnant productivity. And for me, the object of this entire exercise of having a Workshift Commission to work with colleagues and to work on some ideas is to overcome these obstacles that have existed for a very long time and to come up with what I would call progressive, purposeful productivity. You have to have that word purpose in there, because purpose is the dominant theme along with ESG for the corporate world. And you have to have the word progressive in there, because what are we all doing if we don't want to make life fairer and better and more functional? And you have to have, in my view, the word productivity, because what is the point of us doing all of this if we can't be productive? And it's interesting to me to note that the latest ONS figures on labour, citing from the Labour Force survey, show that even though we are 100 million hours a week down on last year, We are still working in the UK 900 million hours a week, okay? We're really hardworking people in this country. The problem is that where we work and how we work and why we work has been largely dysfunctional and epically mismanaged. And so for me, we should be looking in 3 areas, which I'm going to touch on briefly before handing to very illustrious colleagues and to you. One of them is the whole question of where we work and how we work and when we work. And we're calling this strand the Nowhere Office. And I will kick that off with a paper in January, and we'll do a little podcast with Demos on this as well. The truth is, we are not yet anywhere with definitive data and an endpoint on how the office should be. We are literally at the moment nowhere, but there are some early indicators and markers that remote working is here to stay, that Ben Page of Ipsos Mori kindly shared some data with me that they'd presented to the CBI in the summer, and that showed quite clearly that there's likely to be something like an 18% drop in office space use, that office space will be hybrid, will be less based around desks, that everybody expects to recruit on the basis of offering flexible working, and that might present challenges for culture and cohesion and training. And of course, the whole question of skills is not going to go away, it's going to become even greater. So the Nowhere Office is really looking at the place that we work in and how we work. And there is no doubt that that affects the 2 other elements that I hope this commission is going to look at. I hope being the operative word, because Polly and her colleagues are talking to some of you on this call and others about the funding mechanisms to actually get a really rich portfolio of projects from this Workshift Commission. But the 2 other areas that I think link directly, because of the purpose agenda, because of the COVID crisis, and because of Black Lives Matter, all of which have happened in this year, are diversity and the whole question of leadership. On diversity, Dennis is going to speak far more eloquently than I, but it is absolutely clear that there has been a lot more talk than action, that the network science of diversity that shows without question that the more diverse and eclectic and different collections from class, from gender, from ethnicity around the center of the room, the better the outputs. That is not reflected in leadership. That is not reflected in the way in which the world of work operates. It is fundamentally undiverse, both in terms of metrics and its thinking. We want to look at that. We want to look at that diversity piece, not from a sort of antagonistic point of view, but from a point of view of how do we build what we know about diversity into this new, progressive, purposeful, productive workplace. And the final point is leadership itself. I'm not a fan of people that go on and on about leadership. I'm much more interested in how we act. And I'm much more interested actually in management and in meaning. And for me, the big gap has been meaningful management, which is a lot of people not only don't like how they work and when they work and the commute and so on and so forth, they don't feel well led and they don't feel well managed. And in fact, a recent survey that came out last week shows that 1/3 of people don't believe they were well managed through this crisis, or that they had good leadership. And I want to finish with the reference point I think we should use as our beginning for this crisis, although James, I know, is going to take us way back in history. But the starting point for me is not the Industrial Revolution and Taylorism and all of that. And it's not the origins of the post-war corporate world. It's 2008. It's the last crisis. It's the moment that led to a lot of the conditions that pre-COVID exacerbated the crisis of the workplace, the crisis of confidence, the crisis of competence, around workers. And I want to quote you Susie Orbach, the social commentator and psychotherapist who I talked to the other day, and she shared a paper she had given at a conference, unpublished, in 2008, in which she talks about where we work is where we live. And she said this, that work is, and I quote from my notes, a dramatically passionate place for many of us, but it is boring and deadening too. So for me, progressive, purposeful productivity is about meaning, and it's about the people, and it's about the social capital and what I call social health arising out of, but not the sole cause of this health crisis. That's me done, Polly.
Thanks very much. James, do you want to give us the long view? You need to unmute yourself. I'm afraid I can't do it.
I'm unmuted. Can I am heard, yes? Right, the long view. In many ways, before we all got locked into our homes this year, and I do this at the end of my book, is I speculate that we're in the midst of a really quite extraordinary revolution in terms of the way we work and the way we organize work and the very relationships that shape our work. And a revolution possibly as consequential as anything that has happened really since the first embrace of agriculture 10,000 years ago. And at the end of my book, which I put the final full stop on in November last year, I was speculating on the kinds of things that might force us into embracing the big structural forces that have been pushing this change. And I speculated that because humans are basically, we're an extraordinarily adaptable species and we're incredibly good at changing to circumstances when we need to. We're also extraordinarily intractable. We're creatures of habit and we don't change stuff unless it's really forced upon us. And I speculated that perhaps an environmental crisis might be the thing that shifted us forward. Or, and I don't know whether I was hostage to fortune, I also suggested perhaps something like a pandemic, because pandemics have, through the history of agriculture and so on, had a huge effect in changing the way people think. And so it may well prove the case that this pandemic is something that shoves us towards what I think is a really fundamental revolution in terms of our relationship with work. And it's one that people were discussing in loose ways beforehand when we're talking about things like the fourth industrial revolution. And to really get a scale on it, I'm going to go back to that oft-quoted article by John Maynard Keynes in 1930 in the depths of the Great Depression, where he speculated on the economic possibilities for his grandchildren. And he wrote his piece suggesting that by 2030, more or less now, nobody would be working 15 hours a week because ostensibly what he called the economic problem would have been solved. And by the economic problem, he referred to what I suppose we normally refer to as the problem of scarcity, but that fundamental set of assumptions and suppositions that underwrites basically our definition of economics, and with that many of the economic institutions around which we organize our lives, whether it's from debt to exchange and so on. And in Keynes's piece, what he effectively argued was that productivity, capital growth, and technology working together would bring about an end to the need to work in order to meet our basic needs. And that would be carrying on with maybe 15 hours a week while fleets of automata dealt with the rest. It's a question I've been very interested in, not least because it's a sort of timely one, and two, because obviously automation is playing a major role in reshaping the kind of work people do and reshaping the nature of our workforce. Now, Keynes, when he wrote that piece, he said he had one particular fear about what it is that might prevent us from embracing this automated future of great virtue where we did work that we loved rather than tried to learn to love the work we found. And Keynes' worry was that it was our restless purposiveness, our desire to solve the economic problem that was the likely impediment of this. Now, most of my work over my adult life has been working with former hunter-gatherer communities and really looking at the big history of work. Now, the long history of work actually suggests that for most of human history, indeed for the first 98,000 years of human history, our hunter-gatherers ancestors did not work very hard, and they were not obsessed with scarcity in the same way that we are. And so I've been looking at how we might translate that into looking at the kind of things that are inhibiting us from using the opportunity of increased productivity and automation as a means to potentially embrace a different way of organizing our working future. Not least given that there's the fundamental concern that at the moment our productivity at all costs mindset does have very serious environmental implications. In other words, the attitudes and beliefs about work and the very fact that work is an energy transaction in and of itself that has brought us such great prosperity, we now run the risk of cannibalizing that prosperity. In other words, the medicine that has brought us to this state now runs the risk of making us sick. So I've been certainly interested in looking at the way and understanding the way the COVID crisis has amplified some of these currents. Some of these difficult contradictions. And there are questions that have begun to emerge about the effectiveness of markets, which again are governed by this basis of scarcity. The effectiveness of markets in allocating things allocating resources to what we consider valuable. You know, we wonder about the employment of nursing and so on and so forth. Then, of course, there are other related questions that have emerged, which relate to really our ability as so-called industrialized powers to actually have dealt with the crisis that we've endured. And then finally, of course, there is this openness that has come about really as a result of this extraordinary year-long experiment in home working. And it's a year-long experiment in home working, which for the knowledge workers at least, has been surprisingly successful. But what's interesting about it is that it is also one which a year and a half ago, HR managers were telling us it would be a disaster and we'd all be turned into a bunch of sort of demotivated, miserable moochers sitting at home behind our laptops and doing nothing and being miserable. And obviously now that that belief has been torpedoed and we've learned something, there does seem to be a genuine openness towards recognizing that there are other ways of doing things and other ways of working. And in a sense, this is not, the COVID crisis is not, in my view, something that we should necessarily just try and respond to as a short-term thing, but bearing in mind some of these huge long-term trends in the nature of the work and the fact that we're not dominated by the scarcity that shaped our economic institutions suggests that in terms of how we engage with the future around work, we do have to take this longer perspective, because in order to direct our actions for the future, it's not really about responding to the now and responding to the immediate concerns that are arisen, but it helps if we have some kind of vision of the long-term trajectory of the issues that we're facing. And I think this does make this potentially an extraordinary and very interesting moment in our history, one where the changes might end up being considerably greater than they might feel in terms of our change in working and commuting practices in the short term. Thanks.
Thanks very much, James. Alan, obviously at the RSA, you've been working on the future of work, partly because of all of those big longer term trends that James has been talking about. So it'd be great to get your views on what the future of work both could and should look like, and the ways in which COVID might accelerate that, shift it. Tell us what you're thinking.
Yeah, and apologies for being like luminous. I hope no one has had to wear sunglasses and the curtains are falling down. Yeah, I mean, I think I'll not address the full long view that James gets out, although maybe we can get that into the debate. The question I always have on that is, what did early hunter-gatherer society, and this is a genuine question, what did early hunter-gatherer societies think about redistribution to people from beyond their tribe? Because that seems to me the structural issue that argument takes you to, which is why I'm very, 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 very pessimistic in the long view. But let's focus on some medium-term optimism. I think, as James was suggesting there, you know, the idea, the COVID crisis, or the shift for a lot of people to remote working has kind of torpedoed a lot of assumptions that people had. I think we know that it is popular. Obviously, certain tasks are difficult in remote working and easier in an office, and maybe better in an office. But the sort of macro productivity debate, the idea that productivity would go off a cliff, we know that's probably not true now. Certainly seems not to be true. The idea that you need kind of incredibly controlling management structures to drive productivity or motivation, I think that's probably been rebutted now and revealed as a canard. And so there are some kind of like really positive things to come out of this. I mean, commuting makes people miserable. It's really, it's quite as basic as that. And, you know, we're having a kind of on one hand this, on the other hand that debate now. Let's have that debate again in 6 months' time when people have had to spend 2 hours on the district line every day. People will remember what made them unhappy about the old model. So there are real possibilities to move to more flexible, more autonomous, although there are technologies now that can really push against that, but more autonomous management structures and better leadership structures as well. I think the thing that needs to be appreciated about the office is it is a kind of environment of patriarchy, and it has been set up in a way that rewards certain behaviors and certain tendencies, extroversion, and kind of the need for self-validation from leaders, which aren't necessarily best for the running of a firm and management, particularly in the UK. I think other countries have a slightly different management approach, and it's one of the issues we have with productivity, actually. So there's some really good opportunities there, and most of them are kind of within a firm. The kind of problems are beyond a firm or beyond an organization. There are some issues within organizations, young people in particular, and how you build progression and high touch management around young people or early career starters that are within an organization. And I think you know, better management, and definitely a hybrid models probably mitigate most of those, although some of them, particularly young people, are issues connected to their housing and their mental health, which probably require policy beyond workplace policy. But there are kind of 2 or 2.5 really big issues with a shift like this that have to be mitigated. 3 actually. One is the speed, and any transition that is really fast creates problems. You know, we can see this in the 80s, and look at the communities that we're still dealing with, the legacy of issues that emerged from the 80s, a transition that was incredibly quick away from industry in this country. And if you accelerate that, if this is an accelerated thing, then the losers, the impact and cultural shock on the losers is exaggerated. 2, gender. We are moving work into a place which is not equal, which is the home. And that's a massive issue. There's a wonderful writer in the Future of Work who I strongly recommend everyone subscribe to her newsletter, Laetitia Vital from France. She's fantastic on this. And she had a statistic near the start of the crisis, which was from academia, where there'd been no discernible drop-off in paper submissions by men, but an absolutely catastrophic drop-off in paper submissions from women, because the burden of running the home tends to fall to women, and we're all spending more time in our home. That means there's more housework, there's more cognitive load, there's more things to do in the home, there's more management in the home, and that burden has never been distributed equally, and that's an issue. So shifting things home does exasperate certain aspects of gender equality, and that's something I think that needs to be paid attention to. But the big one, which is already coming out in some of the questions from Clement and others, is place and proximity. And I guess the fear that the government has, and the fear that I have, is if you have a fast transition away from commuting, there's an unbelievably high, particularly the UK. The UK is at the extreme end of the spectrum because we're a very consumption-driven economy. But there is an unbelievably high amount of jobs that depend on proximity and commuting. Cleaners, security guards, almost the entire retail sector, hospitality, leisure. They are obviously the jobs that have been most affected by the pandemic. And you can see in the Google mobility data where is, you know, where the sort of there are less people at the moment, and it's obviously city centres. Unfortunately, where there are more people is not the places that are associated with the government's levelling up agenda. It's very much kind of middle class, well-to-do areas. The places where there's more people are like North Norfolk, Cornwall, where people are sort of escaped and moved out. I mean, it is happening. You can see it in the data, but it doesn't necessarily have a particularly progressive element in terms of the political economy of place. And just to sort of double down on this, if we go back to the 80s in industry, if you look at manufacturing, it was the removal of proximity and the removal of proximity within supply chains that turbocharged globalization and meant that you were no longer competing with people broadly on a similar wage in the similar part of the world, but you were competing with the entire world. And that set up the race to the bottom dynamics that have kind of undercut industry in the developed world. In the developed world, there is at least an argument that once you take people away from the office and you move the need for proximity in your service labor supply chain, that you unleash that dynamic in knowledge economy jobs as well. So maybe actually my job can be done by someone in Bangladesh, which is overall, you know, I think there's a counter argument to this. It's been quite good for poverty in certain parts of the world, so maybe it's not a bad thing. But that is quite a politically challenging dynamic that might be unleashed in the developed world from this thing. So there are some real issues in place, and maybe we can come on to how to mitigate those in the discussion.
Thanks, Alan. Finally, for introductory thoughts from Dennis Owusu-Sem. Dennis is an asset manager at Bank of Montreal, but crucially is also the founder of Success Talks, which profiles some of the leading BAME individuals throughout the world. And Dennis brings a really helpful perspective on improving diversity, which is one of the things Julia really wants us to focus on during this Workshift Commission process. So Dennis, I'd love your reflections on how we can improve the world of work.
Okay, what I'll do is I'll probably give a bit of my context and how I actually got to this point, because then that will probably lead into some of my thoughts and provide a bit more of an understanding around that. So prior to this, I created an educational app which had 1 million downloads in the first year. Then started up a networking organization for young professionals, which was about educating them on different topics and how workplace challenges affect them and how they can get around that. And then a work colleague of mine asked me how many Black role models in the UK do you know who are not in music, sport, or entertainment? I could only think up of 3. So I decided to interview as many senior Black leaders as I could find, create an app and then release it. But I'm quite competitive as well. So when I didn't do that, it get to 1 million downloads, pivoted into events, and then started to do weekly events in a private members club, whereby we gather professionals together so that we can convene and share thoughts and share ideas so that we can actually propel ourselves within the workforce. That's now grown, and we do global conferences whereby we invite speakers from the UK, US, and Africa to educate Black and ethnic minority professionals about what we need to get ahead. I think this has been a really interesting discussion, hearing all of the different perspectives. And from my side, I think it was really interesting because I saw a survey the other day from the CMI, which said that 48% of ethnic minority professionals felt that during COVID, that the workforce and the workforce culture in particular had actually improved during this period of time, comparing that to 34% of the population as a whole. And that inherently suggests that there's obviously something wrong with the culture to start with. And from listening to different people and sharing my thoughts and hearing people's thoughts, I think that's mainly due to the fact that ethnic minority individuals tend to find it harder to create those essential relationships that are needed for progression, because fundamentally when you're working in a knowledge-based economy role, it's those relationships with those sponsors that can give you those opportunities to demonstrate your ability, to work on particular projects which will highlight your ability and enable you to progress. What you tend to find is that you can get as many Black professionals into the workforce initially, but then once they get to 3 to 5 years, there seems to be a flattening off and they go to other companies. And it seems to be something across the board in multiple industries. And so figuring out ways to tackle that will actually be important to figure out how to make a more inclusive workforce. I think installing employee resource groups which enable people to come together, to share ideas, to bounce anything that's happening to them in work, can give them that safe space to add to that sense of belonging. I think also when it comes to team building activities, when we're in a physical environment, it can sometimes alienate ethnic minorities, because sometimes this is done impromptu, and you might just meet people at the end of the day and decide to go for a drink, and you may just not necessarily actually bring in other people who may not necessarily share your love for drinks or golf or lacrosse or whatever it is in that regard. And so people can feel alienated in that regard. So when you're in a virtual environment, people are more deliberate when it comes to arranging those activities. And so it's harder to ignore people, which is obviously why certain ethnic minorities are probably feeling a bit more included. Now, I think when we return back to work, I think a lot of companies are going to be going into a hybrid model. But I think it's also important to share that with certain minorities, it obviously might be more beneficial for them to actually stay at home. And I think, as Alan touched, for women as well, it might be beneficial for them to stay at home more. But then there comes another dichotomy in that certain people, if you come to the office, you might be seen as being more productive, especially if leadership are there, because in the workforce, perception and reality are kind of similar, and when in fact you can actually just be as productive at home as in the workforce. And so it's important to identify and to understand that just because someone is working at home and they're not in the office, but they are equally as valuable to the workforce, and not necessarily penalize people and not give them opportunities to demonstrate themselves going forward.
Fantastic. Lots to think about there. We've had some great questions in. Let's start with a question from Charlie Garnett, who I think, drawing on some of what Alan was saying, how do we prevent the rise in atypical, low-paid and unsustainable work that was a signature of the employment growth post-2008 crisis? I think just this question of how we make sure that recovery doesn't just exacerbate the inequalities which have already been sharpened by the crisis. Alan, do you have sort of further reflections on that? You're on mute.
Yeah, I mean, we went into the crisis as the question suggests, a really interesting cultural moment for the UK labour force, which is that work is no longer a guarantee of economic security, which wasn't true in the 80s, wasn't true in the 70s, wasn't true. It's a really unique thing. The poverty, you can be in poverty and be at work. And that's kind of a new situation for us. It's not all. I wouldn't overplay the kind of contract debate and the 0-hour contracts or the agent, or all of that, because basically there are plenty of people who are on employee contracts who can't afford to pay the bills as well. It's a kind of structural thing that goes across both contract statuses. I mean, what do you do about it? I'm a supporter of pretty generous welfare state. I don't think tax credits were necessarily a bad policy, but moving beyond the crisis, I do actually think that we still need to start looking at things like a universal basic income. I'm pro that policy. I think it's a very resilient welfare system, and I think the reality is that we're not going to get back to a kind of almost single breadwinner type labour market, and so trying to regulate based on that is probably not the best approach. I think a lot more of our approach, there are two things. A lot more of our approach to this issue has been about labour market regulation. Even stuff like the minimum wage is labour market regulation. And the two biggest problems that the UK has that are outsized, which play a role in this, are the weakness of trade unions in this country and the ungenerosity of the welfare state. So I would be looking to pull on those levers and try and strengthen trade unions and collective bargaining, and try and grow union density and shift our entire sort of social contract more into a recognition of old school tripartite relationship between business employers and the state, and also, yeah, very generous for also.
Julia, thoughts around, you know, the inequality and the potential kind of, I guess, growing divide between that knowledge economy, which may thrive as a result of this, and other groups who may find that their jobs are more likely to be disrupted?
Well, I think it is the case that we are experiencing tremendous disruption, whether it's, as has been pointed out, the sucking away of the financial oxygen from certain city centres, which I think will not immediately return. I suppose what I don't want the Workshift Commission to do is, in a way, duplicate the kind of work that Alan is doing at the RSA, and to talk about the jobs market as distinct from the culture and productivity of what happens for those that are in work in offices, which of course is not the whole workforce anyway. I mean, I think I'm right in saying, but I'm still trying to kind of get absolutely accurate data on this from the ILO or wherever, that it's about 1/6 of the working world's population is in the professional working classes. But, you know, 5/6 are not. You know, back to James's point, you know, there's an awful lot of people still working fields and even factories. I mean, for me, what matters is that there's been a huge amount of wastage happening in the workplace owing to poor direction, mismanagement, dysfunction, alienation, and that lack of meaning, and a kind of emotional illiteracy amongst leaders. And that's sort of my perspective, is how can we raise the needle on that? I mean, the final point I would just say about the job market per se is, obviously we are in an extraordinary moment when something like half the workforce is being or has been subsidized at some point over this crisis. Far less freelancers, but still I think it's 2.7 million freelancers and 9 million full-time people have had their wages massively subsidized by the government. So I think we genuinely don't know where the workforce and job market is going to be in 9 months' time. I think we have far less clue than we do about what the hybrid office is going to be like. But for me, it's about making sure that the 1/6 of the populations around the world that work in offices, in professional classes, do so in a much better contract with, to coin the old language, their bosses. You know, this is a moment where, for the first time in a generation, workers and bosses are both trying to figure out a way through this transition. The boardrooms have never been more disrupted than they are at the moment, and neither have the workforces. And so this potentially, to go to Alan's point about a social contract, is a really exciting moment too.
So we've had some really interesting questions around productivity. I'll come back to you in a sec, but Dennis or James, do you have any thoughts around inequality or the kind of the models of work? I mean, I guess I'm really struck that this question of trends does feel relatively kind of constrained in terms of what we're talking about. And James, if you take that longer view, you know, is it just that it's an anomaly, the period in which people have been able to rely on a strong, stable employer for a kind of that kind of career?
My guess is probably yes. It's something of an anomaly, and it's something to do with the nature of the beast. As I say, we're in extraordinary times. I mean, we tend to think we have an economy where we still talk the language of labor, where we still talk about, you know, people are still quaintly paid by the hour in some jobs. So on. But the truth is, we're in an economy where capital creates capital mostly. It's, you know, the equation between labor and getting ahead that was very much organic and essential really up until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution has been progressively severed ever more and more. And we've had certain institutional mechanisms that have enabled some greater level of balance to be maintained. So, for example, really up until the 1980s, there was a clear correspondence between really capital growth and real wages growth in many industries. But again, a kind of threshold was reached in the 1980s where, again, capital took on just a whole new level of meaning. And again, there was a link with technology that created that. And really, we're being driven ahead on this thing. The truth of the matter is that as long as our economies become more capital intensive, more gadget intensive, more machine intensive, and that is what they are. And they are becoming ever more so. And certainly in this crisis, as you know, we've had a whole series of, you know, the assessments of the scale of backdoor automation are fairly significant. We are moving progressively forward to a more capital-based economy again, and that is going to raise inequality no matter what. So when we talk about inequality in the context of this particular crisis, you know, there's obviously been some impacts which are short term and will affect some people who are less able, have less broad shoulders to handle it at the moment. But there is a, you know, we remain very much in this big trend. And in a sense, the way inequality has been exacerbated in the course of this pandemic is really a reflection of simply the pandemic amplifying and exposing bigger trends that were already happening and bigger trends that, you know, will remain, require being dealt with. And, you know, again, we had an earlier, Julia mentioned earlier, she invoked the ghost of 2007, 2008 to us. And that again was a sort of great representation of that fact that, you know, really in a capital economy, remedy measures tend to, you know, in an economy based abundance and huge surpluses, basically it tends to be, you know, whatever relief efforts tend to be created tend to accrue predominantly towards where most of the capital is. So in other words, they exacerbate inequality. So I think that's where we are, and I think we can't really look at the current issues without being cognizant of that much broader context, I suppose the Thomas Piketty perspective.
That's what I find genuinely really interesting as a kind of, where are we now? A genuine question, in that everything you said about the capital intensity pushed, in terms of the economy of place, pushed success or economic power, whatever it is, into large metropolitan cities. And that was almost a central fact of political economy of place. Well, political economy almost the strong all around the world, that cities were dominating because of that dynamic. And now we're saying maybe is this maybe not? Is this like you could almost not? I mean, we did some scenarios, and we had one scenario which seems to have played out, which was a black swan kind of event which led to deurbanization in 2019, we believe. And that's maybe where we are, but it was so hard to see deurbanization before. And will that capital dynamic intensity, will that reassert itself and cities will come roaring back? Or will we see a new iteration of it, which you know, pushes away from cities? It's just an interesting question.
Yeah, so I mean, there's lots of questions coming in around urbanism. I think it's one of those areas where there's so much to play out. We certainly can't be certain yet. It's something that we at Demos are already doing some work on. We've got a piece of work coming out on the future of towns, and also on the future of urban spaces based on some modelling, including involving the public on their preferences and expectations. But it does seem, you know, potentially extraordinary shift to a macroeconomic trend towards cities that at least might come into question now. Julia, you want to say something?
Yes, I mean, I think it feels to me like we're all holding a snow globe, not just because it's Christmas, but the thing about a snow globe is it's a contained environment in which all sorts of chaos unfolds, but doesn't actually break through the fundamental confines. So the fundamental confines, as James has said, remains an economic model of capitalism, which does not fundamentally change, is not looking like it's going to change massively. Purpose is an ESG is a focus, but it's not a game changer in terms of the model. So what I think we're going to see is a realignment of the distribution of the resources, of the workers, of the locations, rather like we've seen in media, rather like we've seen in advertising, that you no longer have these central pillars where absolutely all the power resides, but you have a much more lateral than linear and vertical model. And of course, you know, the best emblem for that is the end of the skyscraper. The skyscrapers that are left standing are quite clearly going to be hybrid places, because the function that we've built and that we've modeled to house the world of work for the last 50 odd years has changed, but the basic requirement to work, to reward workers, is still within that snow globe. So I just think that we can't confuse those two states. We're not, I think, having a conversation about genuine revolution at this moment in the world of work. We're having a conversation about iteration, evolution, but we also are having a conversation about agency and about power. And the power is shifting now towards a distributed workforce. Leadership is no longer the only one in control, and that's what's interesting.
So we've had this really interesting question from Yiga Kakad, forgive me if I pronounced that incorrectly, asking about productivity gains. You're right, many corporate leaders, such as Satya Nadella of Microsoft, say that the productivity gains experienced during the initial phase of lockdown were illusory because they burnt through the existing social capital in organization, but weren't replenishing it. I'm struck by one of the things Dennis was talking about was that sense that actually for some BAME individuals or communities, actually a more disaggregated space might be easier to feel included in, and might be a way of building social capital. And certainly in other work we've done with people with disabilities who were like the one sole remote worker, that actually they felt more included, but through a different set of mechanisms. Dennis, do you have any thoughts on how we can build that sense of that social capital, perhaps in a better way, in a different environment or a different context?
That's a really interesting question. I think if I was to take a step back and really think about the year in the main, I think the murder of George Floyd earlier this year brought a heightened sense of racial inequality in not only society, but the workforce as a microcosm of that. And that led on to a number of organizations making a number of statements and making a number of promises at the start and around May or June as to what they're going to do. But I've noticed that has slowly died down over time. And I think it's important for different organizations, if they want to improve the productivity of their Black and ethnic minority workers, that they do a bit more in terms of engaging them. So for example, that could be around data. And it's not just necessarily acquiring the data, it's about how you process it and actually look at it. So obviously we can do things such as your pay gap analysis, which is quite useful to obviously look at the inequities in that state, but then also look at maybe the stay gap analysis in terms of how long it takes for ethnic minority individuals to progress from one rank to another. Because if you compare that to a Caucasian individual who takes 2 or 3 years on average to progress, whereas a Black individual takes 4 or 5 years, inherently you have a problem there which needs to be tackled. And looking at the data at that granular level, it is really important. I also think in order to boost the productivity, it's important to get your employees, especially your ethnic minority employees, actually involved in the process, so they actually feel as though they're part of the company and they're actually part of the change which you need to see moving forward. Because a companies make the decisions and then just pass it down without actually having a well-rounded conversation. And so that's vitally important. And then obviously, once you've obviously made these changes, it's about communicating and communicating regularly. Because at the end of the day, you could be doing fantastic work in terms of actually putting in initiatives to boost the productivity of your workers. But if nobody knows about it, then no one's actually going to think that anything is taking place. And I was actually looking at one of the questions in the chat as well, which is about younger ethnic minority professionals and what we can do to bring them on board in this virtual environment. And I think it's important to give young people especially a lot of support, because it's difficult to build relationships in person, never mind in a virtual world. And so if you can make sure that your young people have that coach who can help them on the day-to-day matters to bring them through, if they can have that mentor who's there to be the sounding board to voice their concerns to, if they can have that sponsor who's there championing them in the rooms where they're not involved and actually allow them to be promoted accordingly, that could be useful. Getting them onto better projects, which enables them to demonstrate their ability so that they can actually progress and feel as though they're part of the company. That will be useful. And then even having a buddy, an informal buddy system for them just to chat to be able to share their ideas and to share their concerns, that will obviously help with the productivity in that regard. And then also maybe be a bit more nuanced in terms of like this virtual environment as well, because at the end of the day, some people are just not comfortable speaking in meetings. And so if you are someone that sees that this person has not spoken and you have the power to change that, you can obviously direct it to that person and say, Holly, what are your thoughts on this? Or enable them to use the chat function, or maybe gather their thoughts before meetings so that they can actually show their ability once they're on the platform. Because I think that in itself will actually help generate more productivity and make a more inclusive workforce in that regard.
Some really practical thoughts there about that question of building social capital and progression in this more, I've seen the word in the Q&A as well, blended or hybrid environments. I'll come to Julia, Alan and James on this kind of productivity question, but just to add one more thought again from the chat is, I think it's been directed at James, this question around a capital economy, but makes the point that actually, certainly in the UK and also beyond, we've expanded our economies exogenously by bringing more people into them, women, immigrants, older workers, for example, and then working them more hours rather than by improving productivity. It's just a reminder of how essential it is for us to crack that productivity challenge. So thinking through productivity and its relationship with social capital. Julia, you are the social capital expert.
Well, high praise indeed. I don't know about that. I'm certainly committed to social capital, and I think that as a policy driver, it is much cheaper and much more scientifically proven than has been deployed to date. I certainly think that, which is probably why Downing Street's civil society unit supported the social capital network that we've set up, and which I'm pleased to say Dennis is a member of. I think that I'd like to finish my remarks by going back to something that Susie Orbach said in 2008 about the emotional literacy of the workplace, about what we feel, about what we do. And she pointed out back then that whilst, if you like, the public sector, she was addressing a conference of public sector health workers, whilst the public sector was being given capitalist-based, commercial, hard-nosed targets and metrics and models from the corporate world, in fact, the corporate world was learning from the therapeutic, psychoanalytic world to the degree that coaching, personal development, and what wasn't even named well-being in 2008, but what became well-being had developed. I would say that all of these things, from diversity in the workplace to well-being, have been in their infancy up until now. We need version 2.0. For me, the concept of social capital is woefully underexploited by organizations. And for me, the concept of well-being has been used A, at an executive level more than at a workforce-wide level, and B, as a fig leaf to cover up bad management, bad leadership, you know, as if it's sort of said to people, it's okay to have mental health issues and stress at work, as if it's nothing to do with the workforce itself making you stressful and freaked out. And so we need to grow up in the way we look about work. Work is done by people, with machines, with automation, but it's done by us. It's done for us. It's done with us. And we need to put that conversation back, regardless of what identity we bring to work, from a class perspective, a gender perspective, a race perspective, an age perspective. And if we can achieve that at a policy level, at a corporate level, at a public sector level, and a private sector level, that's progress.
Great. James, thoughts on productivity? And you've been asked for more evidence that we're moving towards a capital intensive economy.
Well, look, I mean, when it comes to human productivity, I'm not very good at it. I've been struggling to write the same article all bloody week, and it's been driving me nuts. In terms of, you know, total productivity, look, it actually is, again, I'm going to get more philosophical about it. You know, when we talk about productivity, we ask actually what that is. Is it a physical thing? Does it relate to output? Does it relate to the creation of something? And so when we talk about productivity with machines, we're talking about one set of outputs. And when we're talking about productivity with people, we might be talking about another set of outputs. So for example, you know, Julia invokes social capital. And, you know, while we are in an economy where most of our transactions are effectively monetized, social capital does remain a very big thing. It's just the fact that people can monetize it. That's why we're full of Instagram influencers and all the rest. It's a, you know, these different forms of capital are all floating around. So I think there are interesting questions to be asked about what is the productivity that relates to those generating those different forms of capital. And sometimes I don't particularly like the idea of talking about them as capital either, because it requires, you know, the language of investment and interest and so on. But I think for me, it's an area I have questions rather than answers.
That's most things for me. Alan, what are your thoughts on productivity?
I mean, I think Julia spoke very much for me in terms of the workplace productivity, and particularly on the point about well-being policy within organizations being just the latest in a string of kind of different new ideas that try to that companies kind of like bracket off into one little thing without looking at the fundamentals of their management structure and how they treat people. And management is, I really feel like, and there's plenty of evidence on this, an outsize plays a big role in the UK's particular productivity challenges. I think we lionize people like Dominic Cummings, who go into organizations and shout at them and expect that to work. And I don't know, I used to talk about it in terms of football, where, you know, the England and the UK has got an unenlightened approach to management, which is why a lot of the top football managers in the world are not English. And the England team in particular has struggled for a long time. So I think there's a lot we can learn about management from other countries. I think just to go back to the original question, I agree with Satya from Microsoft that actually any productivity spike was a burning through pre-existing social capital of organizations. But I think what we do know is that it's not going to go off a cliff. Like, you know, so there is a conversation here, and you've kind of opened the Pandora's box to do things better in organizations, and I think it's a fantastic thing to look at in this commission, because it sounds almost Pollyanna-ish, but I'll talk about myself. You know, in the kind of September, August period where you know, so you've decoupled it from lockdowns and the crisis energy. I could drop my daughter off to nursery, go for a swim, and still be at the desk for 9 o'clock in the morning. Now, former colleagues, Polly, you know that would never have happened in the old world, and it made me happier. And that's really
good.
fantastic. It's a really fantastic thing that we can capitalize on, where we can give people more time to do what makes them happy, which will make them productive and will improve their well-being. So, you know, there are opportunities here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going to get into the question James is wrestling with, but I mean, I think there's plenty of evidence that we are moving towards more capital intensive, and actually, I don't think the productivity statistics do a particularly good job of capturing intangible investment and that shift. But I mean, it's definitely true.
The really sad news is that we have come to the end of the time we have this afternoon. I could carry on having these conversations and debating Alan's productivity for all day. I'm enormously grateful. Thank you for both asking questions and then engaging each other. I really want to have that conversation about North Wales, but perhaps we'll have to do that offline. As Alan says, we have kind of opened a Pandora's box, and what we're doing at, you know, towards the end of 2020 is kind of opening that up. Look what's inside, so that we can plan a research agenda, a series of events, as Julia mentioned, a podcast, Zooms, discussions, publications that will take us through the year, and hope that we can be of service with practical recommendations both to business, to leaders, to the third sector, and to government, and involve as many people as possible. We are still looking for a range of sponsors who might want to work with us and support either individual research projects within that program or event series. So if that's something that would be of interest to you or to your organization, then please do drop me a line, and we'd love to discuss that. But for the moment, thank you so much to Julia, to Dennis, to Alan, and to James. And thank you all for joining us and contributing.
Thanks. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.